guys, I'm Sai and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation. On the channel we've got podcast series and content on a variety of subjects including mental health, football, serial killers, films, TV, conspiracy theories, writing, music, wrestling and more. All our shows are available in video format at youtube.com/AcePodcastNation or audio at the usual podcasting platforms such as Apple Pods, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and many more. You can keep up to date on upcoming shows by following us on the old social machine, facebook.com/AceCastNation or Twitter at ACEcast_Nation. So today's guest is someone I've wanted to get on for a while. I'm a big fan of his podcast and this, as well as the subject of his podcast. The Oasis Podcast is the only podcast radio show dedicated to the most influential band of the 90s, Oasis. They delve into the history of the group as well as discussing many areas of music and pop culture with interviews and content. So I'm very happy to welcome James from the Oasis Podcast. Welcome, mate.
Hello, mate. How you doing? Just to correct you briefly, that's my blurb,
Yes.
which I wrote a while ago before the official Oasis podcast came out called Listen
right,
Up.
okay.
So there is another one now. And then since then, a couple of other chances have sprung up with their own Oasis podcast, but they're not as good as mine. Mine's really the official, unofficial one.
Absolutely. Yours is the original, the OG one.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, that shows that not only is it a quality podcast, but it's a good idea as well that people sort of cottoned on to it after you had done it, after you had started doing it, and started doing their own.
Well, I think that's the thing with podcasts, and I sort of had a brief go at a podcast like years and years ago with a mate of mine. Bit of a mixture of the music, but we only recorded about 2 or 3 episodes, and it was one of those things that was just getting round to it, and so many podcasts sort of drop off after a handful of episodes, and so starting this one 2.5 years ago now, I just didn't want that to happen, because so many of them, they start and they dropped off after a handful of episodes, and I thought, no, don't do that. I've got to be consistent and just get on with it. And so I'm really pleased. Like, you're talking to me today at a point where I'm going to pass 500,000 listens today.
That's incredible. It's like half a million.
Half a million.
Half a million. It's crazy, isn't it? 500,000 people.
I know.
Listen to you like talking and speaking to people. It's crazy.
It's mental, yeah.
It's like I was speaking to the guy I did a podcast last night with. It's like technology's changed the game for podcasts because you can do them from just your house or your office, and you can speak to people all over the world. And generally, the connection's pretty stable and is good, and it can be just like a phone call. And I think that kind of changed the game for people who wanted to get into podcasting because they no longer had to do it in person or have a studio or somewhere to record it. They can just do it like I do it from your house, do it from whenever. But you're right, a lot of podcasts, they either like start and they do some episodes and then they drop off, or they're not as regular, so you'll get like those initial episodes and then there's a big gap, and then it's not like every Wednesday or whatever day it may be. But like we're so by the time this goes out, I think this is going to be episode number 103 for us. But next week, as we record this, Wednesday will be the 100th episode for us, which is it's really mad to me because we haven't been going since May. So we've been churning out the guests and content, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah.
What we really need is a Liam Gallagher podcast. I think that would be the way to go.
Yeah, well, so Liam just does his own show. I that would be hilarious, I remember, I don't know how closely you followed it, but a few years ago on the later Oasis tours, Noel would do like a blog, and it would basically, he would like, because he didn't really understand the internet, but he just tap it into his phone. He would like text it, and it was like Tales from the Middle of Nowhere, it was called, and that was really entertaining because you're just getting this general backstage sort of normal stuff that it isn't really that much of a big deal, but just when you're getting these little insights into life on the road with Oasis, it was fantastic. And and even stuff like Liam's documentary that came out earlier this year, really interesting. But that's what I'm often more interested in, is just sort of the backstage like reality of the life of what it must be like for these guys. And that's one of the things that's quite cool about the episodes I've done. I've spoke to quite a few people that have been either in the band or played for support bands and things like that. And you just get that more there and go, oh, Live Forever's amazing. But I'd much more be interested to hear about, what was it like? How did you get the call to go and support them? Or people that were the road managers or whatever. So that stuff to me, that actual inside kind of knowledge about what it was like being in that band and then in the years since, is really interesting. And I'm really pleased to be bringing it.
Yeah, it's like if you get like an intimate feel to what it was like, and I think also people forget, like people see the glamorous side of like being the lead singer of Oasis or in the band Oasis, but ultimately, like, these guys, when they go on tour, it's non-stop, like, traveling, and I think it's no wonder they get a bit irritable with each other, should we say, especially then when you add in siblings and copious amounts of alcohol and other such stuff. It's always going to kind of cause friction, I think. But so I know you've had some really interesting guests on your show, which obviously I'd like to talk about some of those in a minute, but I just wanted to get sort of in your own words how you ended up sort of getting started with it, where the idea came from, and like that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So I was obviously a big Oasis fan back in the day. I did media at uni, and I was on the radio station at uni and did a sort of this was in, like, I was at uni from 98 to 2001. So in the year either 99 or 2000, I did like a documentary called Tides of the 90s about like the 90s music. So I was like already doing like retro 90s stuff when it was only still just about the 90s. And then sort of didn't do anything else really, dropped out, didn't do anything sort of media-wise really for years and years. And then it was, as I mentioned briefly, I sort of another guy I was mates with, from uni, we sort of half recorded a couple of podcast episodes, but it didn't really go anywhere. And then it was really getting an iPhone. I mean, that's the big step. I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time. And I sort of thought about, doing various things. I wasn't sure what subject to do because I'm interested in like film and TV and sport, and there's all these different things into a big part. Yeah, and so I looked for years for the Oasis podcast, and there just never was one. And so it was really getting an iPhone. And I thought, well, now I've got the ability to record with literally this little device in my pocket that can do anything. Sort of spoke to a mate of mine who's got a movies podcast called the Movie Multiverse, and he sort of told me about Audacity and how you do the editing software, and you can get this all online for free. So literally one day I just put it in my pocket, just press record and said, welcome to the Oasis podcast, and this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to try and do with this. And then plugged it into Audacity, had a bit of a play around, edited in a few sort of song clips and stuff like that, and then put it out. And then within a few weeks, it was, well, literally in a couple of days, I had hundreds of listens. I think people were just ready and waiting for an Oasis podcast. And so I was like, oh Christ, okay, we need to get a bit more serious with this now. So I thought that was pinged over a few emails just to a few people in the world, and a couple of people came back and said yes. And so I was like, oh right, so it looks like we're doing interviews then. So I had like this guy Mark Felton, who plays harmonica on the Master Plan and Round Our Way and a few other tracks, and then we got Brian Cannon, the sleeve designer who did all the the early Oasis sleeves through to Be Here Now. And that was as soon as I've got Brian Cannon, then it was like that's your calling card, because it was like, okay, this guy's serious. He's got some big names. So yeah, and it sort of took off from there.
Just lagged a bit there. Damn, I cursed it when I said that it was I hadn't had any problems with it. Just cut out completely. I don't know if you can still hear me, but it's just cut out completely.
I can still hear you fine.
Right there you are. You're back again. So frustrating. Why did I open my mouth? Right, you are back. So I'll carry on. I can take that bit out. But yeah, having guests like that is really it's a bit of a game changer, isn't it? Because like you say, once people see, that type of guest on your show, I think particularly people from in and around the bands or in the music industry, they see that level of guest, and they're more likely to agree to come on and speak to you. And I think you've had Alan Mcghee on, haven't you? And a few other. Alan Mcghee was. I listened to a bit of that episode. I haven't finished it yet, but he's got some stories. I say.
Well, Alan was an interesting one because I'd had a few messages back and forth with him on Instagram for probably a year, and and he's unbelievably busy, and he's got all kinds of stuff going on all the time, and I'd messaged him a few times. It was like you sort of drop a message. You don't want to be like an over pushy kind of stalker type person, but he would sort of drop a message back saying, I'd love to, but I'm good friends with both Gallaghers, and I don't want to. I think people are wary in this world that I might just be trying to get them to stir up, or maybe that's what I'm interested. Because a lot of interviewers are just like, they just want you to sort of be on one side or the other, and then try and then the podcast title is Alan Mcghee, hates Noel Gallagher or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think he's been screwed over by people like that before. You mentioned he did an interview with a newspaper about his homelessness charity, and then literally as he's walking out the door, they say, but do you think they'll ever get back together? So, who knows? Forget all the stuff about the homelessness charity. Alan Mcghee says Oasis might get back together, and it's just like, oh, for God's sake, But no. So Alan was, really lovely. I met him in London, did those in person, and I met him in London first, and I think he just wanted to just sort of get the feel of who I am and check I wasn't trying to sort of screw him over, or sort of I wouldn't get him in trouble basically. And then when I recorded with him and sent it to him, and I said, look, you listen to this, make sure that you're happy with everything. And a couple of we had to sort of take out and tweak that. He said, actually, I don't put that in, and I was more than happy to make those changes for him. And and then now I'm actually, I wouldn't say I'm mates with him, but I text him quite a bit, and I've had and I've now done a couple of live events, which
that's really that's awesome, isn't it? And I think unfortunately, whether it's newspapers or people, they spoil it because as Oasis fans like yourself, or for me, we just want to kind of hear the stories and ask questions, talk about what it was like during that time. And then because a lot of the people around and within it are wary of being screwed over by the media, because of over the years, how many stories do you see about people who've said one thing and then it's twisted into something else, in newspapers and whatever, and it kind of spoils it for everyone else, because people, Oasis fans around the world, they would just want to hear Alan Mcghee talk about, those days and all the different things that went on. So it's good that you got him on, and like I say, I think I'm about halfway through at the moment. I listen to too many podcasts, so I get like halfway through, and then a new one comes out which I like the look of, and then I end up kind of listening to that, and then I go back to the other one. But I'm a proper 90s kid. I still dress like I'm in the 90s. I listen to like absolute 90s constantly. If I'm not listening to my own sort of music or podcasts in the car, my kids are getting a bit sick of it now. They want to listen to like stuff from the last sort of 10 years or something. But and I think, and like I look back on the 90s as well, and even the kind of crappy pop music is good to me now, whereas I don't enjoy a great deal of kind of new music. Like there was a period, I think, most probably the way I am with age and time, probably about 10 years ago, I reckon, when like bands like Hard-Fi and a few others like The Enemy and stuff like that, where I kind of got back into more current music, but I kind of fade by. I end up going back to like Oasis and the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays and stuff like that. Or I listen to a lot of like the Doors as well. What sort of music do you listen to, like day to day?
Not much, not much actually. It's quite sad to say. I kind of went off music a lot. I think it was podcasts, really. I'm just more interested in podcasts, and that's what I tend to find myself listening to all the time. I do try and keep up with new music, and I end up, doing the podcast now. I end up sort of listening to a lot of music because I'm interviewing someone. So, for instance, the next episode is going to be an interview with this guy, Alex Lipinski, who's a sort of singer-songwriter, English guy. He played with the big Oasis connections. Him and Bonehead had a band in the mid sort of 2010s called Phony and the Freaks. And so it's like but he's just a great singer-songwriter in that sort of, Dylan, Nick Drake kind of traditions. So I've been listening to a lot of his stuff. But yeah, it's been a really interesting way of getting, of finding out, because there's even people like, there was a guy called Tim Smith who was the guitar player in Noel's band for the first couple of years of the High Flying Birds, and then he was sort of sacked and they've got Gem in now. But yeah, I mean, he had, really great stuff in his own, really. But yeah, I wish I'd had more time for new music, but I find that I think the problem with having too much choice is that I'll listen to something and just go like, no, I'll give it one listen. No, I didn't really like the sound of it, right? And then go back to the Beatles or go back to 90s stuff. So yeah, it is. I don't know. It's difficult. Like I don't know if you've ever heard the Britpop Revival show. Which is on like a Wednesday at 6:00. It's down at they record it down at Exeter, but you can get it online. And so I listen to that most weeks because a mate of mine does it who's been on the podcast, and I'll hear something on that and just like a track I've never heard before by some 90s band that I didn't really follow. And if this was a new band, this would be my favorite new thing I've heard for years. It really would. And it's like, oh no, it was just, by Soda or the Flamingos or one of these other 90s bands that never really made it. And you think, no, it isn't. It isn't that I'm biased. It is just that, it's not as good. It's like the GIF I use quite a lot is there's a brilliant of Principal Skinner from The Simpsons going, am I out of touch? No, it's the kids that are wrong. On Twitter and stuff, because that is pretty much me. I'm going, no.
Yeah,
that's due to have.
The thing with it, I think, just like for me, like this, I look back at the 90s and even like I said, the music I listen to now is largely based around that time, because there was so many awesome bands and good acts and singers and songwriters, and then I find that other stuff, more recent stuff, just doesn't. It never quite compares to it. And my wife thinks it's just because it's like a comfort thing that you grew up with it, and you just that's what you listen to for so many years that you don't really. Or she thinks I won't give new stuff a chance. But if I hear a good song, I'll get it or I'll listen to it and I'll go back to it. And like I'm quite varied in my musical tastes. Like I don't just like indie music. I quite like some sort of hip hop, but a lot of the hip hop I like is from the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah,
I don't really like new sort of hip hop and rap and stuff like that. And it's the same with bands. I kind of just like there's not a lot of new stuff which I like, but one of my favorite bands that I ever saw live was James, who I think they were supporting Oasis in Cardiff, and it was such an awesome gig because you had James first, who I would have paid to see on their own, and then Oasis straight after. I didn't even know if James still together. I'd be very interested to know if they were still going.
I think that I'm sure they toured a couple of years ago. I think they're one of these bands that sort of will tour and then sort of, split up, and Tim Booth will go off and do something else for a bit, and then they'll tour again a couple of years later, I think. But I'll give you a funny one about James. So we did the Tony McCarroll. The first live event I did was in May at the Waterettes in London. There's an interview with Tony McCarroll on stage, and we had different bands on as well. And one of a mate of mine from home, he looked at it, and because my name's James, and so it said like James, and then Tony McCarroll, and and then my mate George from home was like, "Oh, I thought you had James playing." Like it's like, mate, it's 12 quid a ticket. You're not going to have James. So yeah, he goes, "Oh, so James." Anyway, but yeah, so we didn't have James, but you know, Tim, if you're watching, you are more than welcome to play at one of our live events.
Absolutely. So how did the live events get started for you then?
Well, it was a funny one because I was in a band in the late 90s, and me and the sort of the guys from the bands don't get to see each other very much, but we'll meet up every couple of years. We'll sort of arrange a meetup, and we're trying to arrange a meetup for this last May, and it was one of those, right, well, if we're going to meet up, you know, should we try and tie it in with going to see an Oasis tribute band, because we're all big Oasis fans. And I was like, well, hold on a minute, if I know all the Oasis tribute bands and I've got listeners. So, well, if I'm going to do that, why don't I book a venue and book an Oasis tribute band and sell tickets, and then I could, you know, might actually make some money from it, and obviously provide a wonderful experience for all the listeners that come. And then, but then, literally, Tony McCarroll contacts me and says, "I'm looking to do these Q&As this year." He's like, you know, basically, he's got a proper job, and he took a year off from it, and was like, right, I'm going to do, with it being 25th anniversary of Definitely Maybe, I want to go and do some Q&As and DJ stuff around the country. So brilliant. Well, let's tie in and do a Q&A with Tony then, and you know, and get a couple of bands to play and stuff. So it literally, but no, it was brilliant. You know, he physically sat at the kit and played a bit of Supersonic, which was like magic, and yeah, and the whole evening went really well. I sang on stage, like me and a couple of the guys from the band sort of did a couple of Oasis covers, which was really good. But no, it was a really great event. You know, I really, really enjoyed it. And then I've done another couple now with a company called Tora that work with Mcghee. So the Mcghee ones I've done, it's not been like I haven't organised it and stuff. I just stepped in to host those, which were really good. And then Glasgow, we just did another one with Tony a couple of weeks ago up in Glasgow, which was fantastic. So it's been great. There's quite a lot of stress and hassle to organise, and it means that the podcast, you know, I spend a lot of the time in the podcast like hassling people to buy tickets and stuff. And obviously, if you're in America or if you're in, you know, Exeter, you're not going to come to Glasgow. So I'm aware it probably, you know, doesn't make the podcast as much fun to listen to. So I'm going to knock those on the head for a bit. I think we might look at some bits again next year. Yeah, but
it must be quite the you know, quite the experience and stuff to, you know, to do live events with people, you know, like who've been in, you know, Tony McCarroll, been in Oasis. That must have been like such a, just from a fan point of view. And I suppose you kind of, because you're there to do a job yourself as well as hosting it, you kind of get lost in that. But also as a fan, you must have been like quite a cool moment being on stage with him. And
it was amazing. Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, I think with the first one in May, I bit off a bit more than I could chew, because not only was I doing the interview and doing all the hosting, as in bringing the bands on and sort of organising it and make sure the tickets all went okay and all that sort of stuff, but I was singing as well. You know, I'd sort of, you know, we'd sort of said we'd do 20 years, and so I thought, well, let's just do it. You know, I'm around, like, it's a safe space, it's all listen to the stuff, you know, and if we're just doing Oasis covers, you know, no one will really mind. It's not like you're doing you know, your own stuff.
Yeah,
that was a lot of like stress, really, and it was just like, okay, let's just get through part 3. But as soon as the interview started, I mean, the main thing was it was just so rowdy. Like, everyone was drunk and really excited to be there with Tony, and people just going like, "Tony, you're a legend, mate," and all this sort of stuff. So that was really, it was more like, it wasn't like a, you know, like I'm being brought on to do a chat show or something, like a literary event or something like that. You know, it was much more like a, you know, everyone's going, "Ray!" and I'm just sort of really trying to, control the crowd really.
Yeah.
So I didn't have time to be kind of nervous, because I was just like, ask Tony a question and then try and tell people to shut up and let him do the answer without them going like, Tony, or like, fuck Noel, or any of that stuff. So it was it was.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be quite stressful, I gotta be honest. So what what band members, or tell us about, to some of the guests you've had on, whether they've been in the band or around the band or support bands, because I know you've had a lot of cool guests on.
Yeah, no, I really have. One that the important thing for me was, I wanted it to be, the for the people as well. So it's a mixture of people that were either part of the inner circle of Oasis, whether it was physically in the band, support bands, managers, people that were just involved in it in some way. And then also, people that have been inspired by them and then gone on to do other stuff, or that were just mates with them and things like that. So, and it's meant that I've got to speak to some real heroes of mine. So, for instance, I'm a big boxing fan. I interviewed Ricky Hatton earlier this year, which was just, for me, it was absolutely incredible. I mean, it was only like 15 minutes on the phone, but I'm talking to Ricky Hatton. That for me was as big as anything, because I massive boxing fan, massive Ricky Hatton fan. I flew to Las Vegas to watch him fight Floyd Mayweather, and wow. Now I'm speaking to him on the phone. It was amazing. So Ricky was great. And I mean, in the world of sport, like Ken Doherty, Ken Doherty's a big Oasis fan, the snooker player. So it's like, this is just cool, But then it's also a lot of the human interest stories as well. So, I've had a couple of people on that have had very serious illnesses, cancer and things, and they've sort of come through it, and Oasis has been a big part of their life, saved their life, really interesting as well. So it's true, because so many people, and they might, but really, what's the insight other than, oh, I saw them at Nebworth, it was amazing. Great, I could speak to a million people that saw them and said it was great. But what it means more to me, and what I find more interesting is, and it changed my life for these reasons. So so it's good. I'm always interested in hearing other stories as well. If people have watching this and have got a particular story connected to it, then do get in touch, because as I say, it isn't anyone that's got an interesting story, I'm more than happy to speak to. Because it's not, it's about the whole, Oasis were a band of the people, and that was so much important part of that whole story, in a way that I don't think, Radiohead or even Blur or something like that, I don't think it would be as much. I think Oasis are probably similar to the Manics or similar to the Smiths, where the people and the interaction with people and the fandom is a huge part of what they're all about. So yeah, and I'm really happy that is part of what we do.
Yeah, it's the thing is with music generally is it affects people in such a way that years later you can think back to something. So whether it's it could be an illness or something good which has happened. So for me personally, when I was 16, my father died. And one of the things which got me through that initial period, the sort of the 6 months straight after, was listen to Ian Brown's first solo album had just come out.
Oh, really?
And Oasis, obviously they were Stone Roses and Oasis was my two favorite bands, and I listened to Ian Brown's album almost on repeat for about 6 months, and that got me through that, because I was 16-year-old boy. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about how I was feeling and stuff like that. And music got me through that because you take, when you're emotional, you take more, you just take more notice of the words which are being, have been written by the songwriters and the singers. And I just think music is just a different animal to all other forms of entertainment, because I think, a good songwriter or a good song written by a talented songwriter can really affect you emotionally, or it can, when you hear that song years later, it can take you right back into the, that emotion. So quite often if I hear My Star by Ian Brown, it takes me right back into my bedroom and sitting there on my own, and I had a red light and posters everywhere, and I still smoking like a chimney then. But like it just takes me back, and that's why even though I'm similar to you, I don't listen to music now like I used to, 20 years ago for various reasons, whether it's podcasts or doing podcasts or like just kids and life generally. But I do enjoy talking about music, and I just listening to it is just, I don't know, it's just different to everything else.
Yeah, there's something very special about music itself, and people have written about it for years, how that is, you've got books or you've got films or you've got all these other things, whereas there is just something so special about music, and whether that's the classical music or then when you've got words to it as well. It's interesting. One of the things that Oasis connect with people in this way that not many other bands do, and yet the people are often very rude about the lyrics, oh, he just knocks them out on the back of a fag packet. I saw Liam Gallagher this week at Birmingham Arena, and and he plays Supersonic, right? And Supersonic is the most stupid lyrics of you can possibly get, and yet there's thousands of people arms around each other singing like this is like some Christian, hymn. I know a girl called Elsa, she's into Alka-Seltzer, she sniffs it through a cane on a supersonic train. And they're singing. But it's just something special about being in that place with all these people, celebrating this mix of words and melody and chords. It's magic. Music is magic.
Yeah, they had Oasis was just special in the melodies and the lyrics, even though you could say, like you say, sometimes maybe the lyrics are not the most complex. There was just something special about them. And the time, obviously, it was the right time for a rock and roll band, if you like, to get back into the forefront of the sort of music business. But and like obviously the Brit pop or the indie scene in the 90s was just incredible. Even the bands who I don't necessarily think were my cup of tea at the moment, at the time, I look back and I think, God, they were really good. Like, I'm not a massive Radiohead fan, but I really like the one album I really like is Pablo Honey. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. But I'm not really into Radiohead. But then again, I compare it to stuff which I've heard like more recently over the last 15 years or so, and I think, wow, we were blessed in the 90s of really good bands all the way up into the early 2000s, really. Okay, so just I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, just general questions for the last sort of 10 minutes or so. So do you think they will get back together? That's the question, isn't it? That's the question. It's a nice easy answer.
How long did it take to get there? Okay. So short, medium, or long answer?
As long as you want.
Okay. So in reality, when we talk about Oasis getting back together, what we really mean is Liam and Noel Gallagher, right? Yeah. Because Noel Gallagher is never going to. Noel Gallagher is managed by Ignition, who are still the manager of Oasis, right? So legally, I don't think Liam Gallagher, even though Noel left Oasis, so in 2009, when Noel left Oasis, Liam legally could have carried on. Instead of calling it BDI, he could have called it Oasis, right? I think legally he probably could have done that, but he chose not to. And I think everyone would accept that Oasis without either Liam or Noel would not be Oasis, right? Yeah. So that's just point number one. This is the long version. Point number two is, so we're saying that you have to have a Liam and Noel together, and we can worry about, who else is walking. Is that right now you've got a situation where Noel is married to a woman called Sarah, and Liam hates Sarah, and Liam will regularly insult Sarah. He calls her a witch. He's written songs about her. He insults her on stage. He's been rude about her looks. It's, it's outrageous, really. You know, that, you know, imagine if you were like that with your brother or whatever. It's not okay. But anyway, and then you can say, and Liam fans would jump back, oh, well, Sarah said this about him or whatever. But anyway, so there's the point you get. Liam and Noel's wife don't get on. And so then all these other things have happened because of that, like, you know, little wars and little bits, like Noel posted a few months ago, like Liam had sent a message to Noel's daughter and things like this. And so there's all that horrible family stuff that's just very unpleasant. So what that means is, really, I think that something would have to change significantly there to be the first thing, to actually get them in the room together. Because so either that's Noel, somehow Liam and Sarah buried the hatch, or split up with Sarah. Those are really the only two ways I can see that happening. This is awful, but the Stone Roses got back together a few years ago, and the reason was they met at Manny's mum's funeral. Yeah. So it's horrible to say, but I think the way it would happen, you need Noel and Liam to get in the same room together, number one, which they haven't done for over 10 years. It will probably be their mum's funeral when Peggy dies, because then they'd have to be in the same room together, right? So at that point, it's awful to say, but that is the one thing that I think could stay at least in the same room together, and then could discussions happen? Could they then bury the hatchet? And then maybe, only then, I think, could something potentially happen. But then you've got, well, we know Liam would do it in a heartbeat. Noel doesn't need the money. He doesn't need the fame. He doesn't want the hassle. When you see him on tour now with the High Flying Birds, they're a brilliant band. You know, their music might not be everyone's cup of tea, but the band, as in a bunch of players on stage, are brilliant. Noel's got no hassle, no grief. He gets on with all the members. He doesn't have, you know, he can do what he wants. He can be centre stage. He tours when he wants, records when he wants. He's got a great life. So why would he open himself up to having to work with Liam, who is notoriously difficult, might not turn up for her, and Noel has to shift from being back to the side of the stage again. So there's no reason for Noel to do this, other than, oh, sorry, let's just do it because it'd be great. So, yeah, so that's the long answer. The short answer is no, unless there's some very, very specific circumstances.
Yeah, I think, like, for me, I thought up until about 6 months ago, I was thinking, I think they probably will, because they were starting last year. There was a few rumblings in papers, and I thought, oh, maybe. And then as soon as Liam had posted to Noel's daughter, I was just like, yeah, that's probably the end of it, because once you start, as a father myself, like, I'm, you know, everyone's very protective of their children, and there's like a line, like, and I think siblings argue. The wife was probably too far, but the daughter was definitely too far. And I think it would take a lot to come back from that. However, you know, there's always, I've seen, you know, family members and people and friends fall out, and I think they're never gonna have anything to do with each other ever again. And then, you know, 10, 15 years later, they are back on speaking terms and friends, and, you know, as if they never had those problems. But Liam doesn't seem like the kind of guy who's, you know, I don't know him, so I shouldn't comment, but he doesn't seem like the guy who's going to apologize to Noel's wife and, you know, say, sorry, sorry about that, you know, I was being a dick or whatever. I just can't imagine it. But then you just never know, because, like you say, Liam would do it in a heartbeat. He's openly said he wants to do it. And I, you know, as a fan, that's like the dream, isn't it? Is to just to see them do one tour. It'll probably be bloody all sorts of carnage in various ways, and they probably finish the tour by arguing and splitting up again. But
yes,
it's certainly interesting. What about Liam then? What do you make of? All right, first question on Liam. Do you think that he is the greatest frontman of a band ever?
Well, that's very interesting. So by frontman, you're taking away people like Paul McCartney and John Lennon, I suppose, because then as a frontman is a specific thing.
Yeah.
So might not be number one, but he's on the Mount Rushmore of Mercury, who is very difficult to argue against, because in terms of vocal and performance and everything, Freddie Mercury's pretty untouchable. Yeah. Liam's a different kettle of fish, because he doesn't perform, he just sings and and stares at the crowd and that sort of thing. So it's a very different thing to what someone like Freddie does. I think that probably chuck in Jagger in there. I'm not sure if he's in the conversation, but yeah, for me it's a straight shootout between Mercury and Gallagher, and it really comes down to what you prefer. If you prefer the sort of the more theatrical and over the top, then you'll go with Mercury. If you prefer the more rock and roll, then you go with Gallagher.
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely it's a personal choice, isn't it? There's just there's something special about Liam. He's just got this charisma and this presence on a stage that when he used to come out for Oasis, and even now with his solo shows, is when he comes out, like people are glued to him. They want us. And I think some of it's probably because he is quite unpredictable, and he can, he can have like a bit of a tantrum, or he can kick off, and it can. So you're almost looking for that as much as you are, his on stage presence and stuff.
What about on that side? Actually, I'll just say that a couple of other names spring to mind when you say that. I love the Pogues, and Shane MacGowan's got that 100%. When you go and see the Pogues in recent years, I mean, Shane's a mess. He can't. He'll miss it when he's supposed to come in, and you can see the other guys in the band like shaking their heads and go, "Oh, come on!" He just keeps getting it wrong, and they'll have to sing in until he knows to join in. But this is shambles. He's on stage. He's the stage and the songs that sounds without him, and that's the time you go to the bar. It's not interesting. The musicianship is 100% better without him there, but as soon as he's not there, I'm not interested. So and it's the same with Pete Doherty as well. Having seen him, I'm not as big a fan of him, and I saw him a couple of years ago, and his kind of routine feels a bit well trod now. Like, okay, mate, that's fine. Can't you just actually do it properly now? I don't really give him the same sort of leeway as I give someone like Shane. But yeah, no, it is that captivating factor of the danger. And you're absolutely right, Liam. He's often. I just at this gig on Tuesday in Birmingham. At the end of the last song, which was Cigarettes and Alcohol, all the other band members had left, and the feedback's just going from the guitars, and he's just put his parka up, he's put his hood up, he zipped it up, and he's just stood there as this feedback's around, and everyone's sort of standing around like, what's he doing? And he's just stood there, and he just stood stock still for about 5 minutes, and then he just pulled it off again, like and laughed and walked off like that. And so he was just winding us up, like you're like, what is he going to do? And he's got that not many other people have got.
Absolutely. You just mentioned the Pete Doherty. When the Libertines came out, I really liked the Libertines. There's I forget which album it is. There's one album which is like it's amazing. I really really like it. And obviously like drugs just ruined the band or with Pete, and they fell out and stuff. But like I thought the Libertines were gonna really take off after that album and become the next like proper worldwide British band, and sadly they just didn't. I just feel like they didn't achieve what they potentially could have, because they're very talented, musicians, and Pete Doherty at that point was a good frontman. They had everything, and it just never quite. I felt anyway, it never quite got to the kind of the limits and where it could have gone, I think.
Yeah, but I'm fine with that. I think that we've got 2 classic albums, and great singles, and and they caused such a riot at the time. It will be one of those rock and roll stories. And they did a 3rd album, didn't they? But I didn't think that was that great. But like so that period, that early 2000s period where they were together and just it was exciting, and they were really really exciting. And I think it's almost like that kind of Greta Garbo, I Want to Be Alone or whatever. They didn't sort of just keep going and going and going, and another album, another tour, another album, another tour, like the Manics. I've been the Manics loads of times. I saw them a couple of years ago, and it just feels like, okay, that's what Manics shouldn't have been that. They should have quit. Maybe probably not after Richie went, but maybe after kind of the Everything Must Go, or after This Is My Truth. Okay, you've told your story. That is your story is done now. I think that would have been the time to stop and move on, and then you would have had this perfect kind of 6 albums or whatever it was, as like, this was the story. Whereas they've just kept going, and there's been some great music in that time, but it's almost like it's better to burn out than to fade away. Well, there you go. It's sort of, they've just kept going, and it's been great, and fair play to them. Who am I to tell them no, you shouldn't be touring and putting on amazing shows for these fans, and but it's just a shame that it's not, the story isn't as good that way.
Yeah, and I think with the Manics, sometimes I like their more recent stuff. I just kind of look at it and I listen to it, and it doesn't feel as special as their early stuff. Like some of their early stuff was really exciting and special, and you felt like you were witnessing something special. Whereas their more recent stuff and their newer stuff, I feel like I don't want to say half-assed, because that sounds like I'm not saying that it's terrible, but it just feels rather than exciting and fresh and good. And any new album should feel fresh and good and new and something new. And I sometimes feel like their more recent stuff doesn't feel new, which is a bit of a problem.
I mean, the point I made, I can't remember if I've said this on the podcast before, but it feels like they've been celebrating their legacy for about 20 years. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, now we're going to do an album that is like, that Journal for Plague Lovers, which was like, almost like Holy Bible 2. And then it's like, and then they did the album that's like, oh, we're getting back to the Everything Must Go sound now. And it's like, it's like another greatest hits. It feels like they're constantly celebrating their legacy, but you can do that once. You know what I mean? You can't then do that for 10 years or whatever. But hey, look, they're one of my favorite bands. I love the Manics. So there you go.
Another band I heard recently, I heard them on Radio X, and they had a new single out, was Shed 7. I've always been a bit of a fan of Shed 7. They got a couple of classic songs, obviously, but I actually really liked their new song, which they played on Radio X, which I was quite surprised. But I think they kind of took a break, and then they come back, and I hope that my hope is for bands like Shed 7, like a smaller band, who didn't get to the levels of your Oasises and your Stone Roses or your Manic Street Preachers with the worldwide kind of fame. They did very well, and they were big at the time. My hope is always that when they come back and do these comeback tours, and they go touring again, is that they make money, and I want them to their talents to be kind of appreciated by today's music fan, and they get basically they get paid, because they're very, Shed 7, for example, I think are a very, very good band, which perhaps didn't get the credit they deserved because of the other bands that were around at the time. Yeah,
because they were like the 19th best band or whatever of 1996. But that was because there was amazing bands. But I interviewed Rick Witter, actually, and he's a great guy. He'd probably do your podcast. He's a lovely guy. But he's so they did split up. Well, they sort of went away for quite a long time, but then they've been doing these tours. They call it Shedcember, and they do every 2 years. They do a big sort of December tour, and it's amazing because, like you said, at the time they were sort of a mid-level band, whereas now on the last tour, Cast were supporting them.
That's
and you'd put Cast. You'd say like Oasis were here, then you've got Blur and Pulp, and then you've got like Ocean Colour Scene, Manics, Cast, and you'd have Shed 7 down here, whereas actually Shed 7 higher now, and I think it's away. And they've been. I was talking to the guy, the Star Shapes nights, Rob, who runs those. I've sort of talked to him quite a bit, and there's a lot of people that haven't gone away, and so if you're just constantly gigging, then naturally, if you're doing 300 shows a year, then naturally you're going to be smaller shows. So someone like the Blue Tones, like Mark Morris, Dodgy, like these bands that haven't gone away. They've just kept playing and playing and playing. So they tend to play much smaller places. Like Tom Hingley from the Inspiral Carpets, he'll play pubs, but which is fair play. If that's what you want to do, that you want to be a working musician, you want to play every night, you can play every night, but it will be to 100 people, not 10,000 people. Whereas, Shed 7, they're very clever. They do festivals, and then they do the Shedsember once every 2 years, and they sell out arenas. It's amazing.
That's
really
incredible, isn't it? Yeah, that's amazing. That is.
Just it out. Perfect.
Sorry, you just cut out a bit then. Yeah, no, that's awesome to hear that they're doing so well, and I bet those events are amazing because you've got to wait 2 years to go there and to see them live. It makes it special.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, final question then to finish off: what is your favorite Oasis album?
Okay, that's tricky. So, favorite is difficult. Best is difficult, right? Because this is where I'm a pedant and I'm a geek. So I sort of have to be very specific about these things. I did a spreadsheet breakdown of, I rated every single Oasis song out of 10, and then so I can give you like averages per era or per album. And the best album is in terms of the highest number average song rating is Morning Glory, right? Morning Glory is the highest rated. I think you've got songs on there that there's very little that's below like a 9 or an 8. My favorite, as in probably the one that means the most to me, is probably Be Here Now, because I was 17 when Be Here Now came out in August 97. So that to me was the soundtrack of me kind of going, ending 6-4, being in a band, going to Be Here Now is the album for me, probably the height of my Oasis fandom. Whereas Maybe is the one I probably is the best listen to just stick on. I'm going on a road trip, just stick on Definitely Maybe. It's like 45 minutes of just brilliance. So those three are neck and neck in their own sort of different ways, really. But in terms of my favourite, I'd probably go Be Here Now, because, as I say, it's the one that means the most to me.
Yeah, What's the Story is kind of my go-to listen. But yeah, I'm the same. Be Here Now, I was like 16, 17 when that came out. I remember using my paper round money to buy it on CD and just being in awe and just listening to, do you know what I mean, every like on repeat and stuff like that. But actually, one of my favorite albums is the Master Plan. I love it. And when you think that's an album of B-sides and live performances, it shows how special Oasis were, that they could put out an album of B-sides and it be pretty much as good as anything anyone else has put out.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think of it as an album. So I had so listen to it as now. I would listen. I didn't came out, but I would listen to the Some Might Say single to hear Acquiesce. I would, and so that's how I did it. So I never really thought of it as an album. Like I couldn't tell you the track listing. I know it ends with Master Plan, but I couldn't tell you the track list because it's on my shelf. I've listened to it a few times, but I always tended to listen to them as singles. So a lot of people will say that's the favorite album. And I suppose if you're driving around with the CD in your car and that was the CD that you go to the most, then absolutely, I can after that as an album. As a collection of songs, it's unbelievable. I spoke to Mcghee about, why did you put something like the Master Plan song on a B-side? Like, why would you put Acquiesce on a B-side? This doesn't make sense. Why didn't you hold them back? And his answer was, look, we didn't realise. We thought this was going to carry on forever. We thought this vein of Noel's songwriting was going to go on forever. Like, we just thought he was going to come up with a Master Plan and an Acquiesce and all these Talk Tonights and all these amazing songs. We thought he was just going to keep being able to write them. But yeah, he said that's my fault. That's my fault, because as the record boss, he could have put his foot down and said, no, we're not putting Acquiesce on the B-side. Or somebody say, hold it back. And they could have put out another if you imagine like a lot of those B-sides going on Be Here Now, instead of some of the We Could Be Here Now songs. I mean, that would have been an incredible third album that probably would have sold, in the Morning Glory levels as well. But they didn't do it because they just, but it made it more special, and when you look at the record books, the weeks on chart, when you look at like 95, 96, 97, those basically EPs, these 4-track CDs were just constantly selling. And because it was before the Master Plan CD came out, it was the only way of getting hold of a lot of these songs. Because it might be one song and then 2 remixes, whatever. Whereas, forks that are all brilliant. And so you pay £4 at HMV and you get like this mini EP of 4 absolutely amazing songs. You say, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Has Stay Young, Angel Child, and then what's the cover? I think it might be Heroes. But
yeah, it's a really special time, and like I say, I'd love to. I hope one day I'll be able to get Alan Mcghee on my podcast, because I'd love to pick his brains about like the stuff that you were just talking about there. It's really really interesting to me just to hear that side of it, as well as hearing like stories about living it, but just also like the stuff about the B-sides I find fascinating, because they had so many good B-sides that could have been number 1 singles. That is, I don't think anyone's ever done that, really. Like, I can't think of another band who's got like a catalogue of B-sides that are good enough or would have been good enough to release as singles, and probably would have done very, very well, the majority of them.
Yeah, I think that the Beatles, I think you could probably say they had quite a few good B-sides. I think the Jam, definitely, and the Smiths. I think those 3 are bands. Well, I suppose the Jam and the Smiths inspired by the Beatles to do that. How Soon Is Now was going to be a B-side. You know what I mean? So I think those 2 were definitely in that world of no, we're gonna. And then the Stone Roses as well. Going to the Roses. I mean, that vein of form that they were in. With the What the World Is Waiting For and Mercy Ice and Going Down, and like the complete Stone Roses album is, just as good as the Stone Roses, with just all those other songs from around there. Yeah, it was definitely a thing, and I wonder, it's not an American. The American thing was always the albums, but I think there have been these British bands that have. No, we are gonna put some great songs on the B-sides. So yeah, it's definitely a tradition of some of those great bands. But I think they did definitely take it to that next level.
Complete Stone Roses, one of my favourite albums of all time as well. That's a thing of beauty. Okay, James, tell the people where they can find your podcast and where they can find you on social media.
Well, search Oasis Podcast anywhere on the internet and you'll probably find it. It's not Listen Up, the Oasis Podcast. It is Oasis Podcast. I have got oasispodcast.co.uk, which just takes you to the Audio Boom sort of page, which is where the podcast is hosted. I'm on Oasis Podcast on Twitter and Facebook, and Oasis Pod on Instagram, and you can support me on Patreon if you want to, which is patreon.com/OasisPod, which is where we do exclusive extra episodes and things like that. Like I did my top 10 BDI songs and things like that I probably wouldn't do on the main podcast page, but we'll do on the Patreon page. So yeah, if people want to chuck me a couple of quid, then we do that, and and stay in touch, because we do these events around the country as well, and there's more exciting things.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, mate. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on some of those events and things you've got going on, because they all look like they were real good time. The ones like looking back, guys, you can find me on Twitter at ACEcast_nation, Facebook.com/ACEcastNation. All the shows in video form at YouTube.com/AcePodcastNation. And audio at iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Apple Pods, everywhere. James, thank you for joining me, mate. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll speak again very soon. And guys, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.